Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society and to standing up, stepping forward, and speaking out, the political courage to take a principled stand. And this is part of our Speakers Fund lecture series. I'm Catherine Allgore, and I'm the president here at the MHS, and I would like to extend a special welcome to all first-time attendees and those of you new to the society. The Massachusetts Historical Society was the first society in the United States. We've been collecting since 1791, and we collect all the way through to today. And our mission in the 21st century is to make that collection available to as many people as possible in ways that they find useful. And that's why we have a really robust teacher training program. It's how we're able to educate thousands of students across the state in civics and history through National History Day in Massachusetts. We support the latest in academic scholarship, and we have a whole range of activities from exhibitions to publications to public programs, all aimed at, well, people like you, people we call the intellectually curious. In fact, next week, we're opening our very first all-virtual exhibition. It's a timely topic with a timely title. It's called Who Counts? Voters' Rights Through Political Cartoons. And I'm happy to tell you that most everything we do at the MHS, we do for free. And you may wonder how we can do that. We are a private organization and we don't get any support from the state or the city. Well, the answer lies in a large and generous group of supporters who make everything we do possible. And I know there's a lot of you out there, so thank you very much. And we would like everyone to be a part of the community. So just go to our website, which is masshist.org, and click on the support button, and you'll find ways to make a donation, make a gift, or better yet, become a member. And while you're on the website, do poke around because we have some pretty compelling things there as well. So before we start, in addition to thanking John Dean and Bill Weld, I'd also like to express my gratitude to the people who make this kind of program possible. And first is Charlie and Kitty Ames, who founded the Speakers Fund series. I want to also thank Nuke Stillwell and RJ Lyman, who did their backstage magic. And I'm also proud to say that Mr. Lyman is a fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And finally, I want to acknowledge our moderator for this evening, Edward Widmer, who is Ted to us. Ted is a member of our Board of Trustees, and he is an active and enthusiastic citizen in our intellectual community. This program started when Ted brought us a year ago, really the thought of doing a program examining the connections between Boston and the Watergate episode in our history. And there are really some fascinating and many more connections than you might think, including actually an MHS and Watergate connection. But as we included the panelists in our program tonight, the conversation evolved. And I think that we're bringing you tonight an even more exciting program than that, which is about the need for political courage. So thank you, Ted, for getting us started then and for getting us started now. So I'll turn it over to you.
Catherine, thank you so much. And I'm glad you mentioned Gavin and RJ Lyman because they did a huge amount to make this very exciting program come together. We do a lot of older history at the MHS, and we do recent history as well. And sometimes we do both of them at the same time. And in conversations around the society about a year ago, as Catherine said, I was remembering the pride I felt as a kid growing up in Boston in the 60s and 70s when we felt pride not only in the Red Sox and Celtics and Bruins, not so much the Patriots back then, but in the way Boston was admired around the country for the strengths of its own political institutions and the way it sometimes played above its level in the national scene. And that was a feeling especially true in the years of Nixon's presidency. There was a bumper sticker you could see a lot in the months after in the fall and winter of 72, 73. Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts. And that feeling was persistent throughout those years. It was a feeling one could have reading the Boston Globe, which co-published the Pentagon Papers, or reading the fiery op-eds of the chairman of the board of the MHS in those years, Thomas Boylston Adams, or perhaps more than on any other night, the night of the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973, when two people from Greater Boston, Elliot Richardson and Archibald Cox, resigned rather than follow the orders of President Nixon. And there was a feeling that Massachusetts was acting on conscience, and then that was a very good thing for the rest of the country. And later, as I became a very junior speechwriter in the Clinton administration, Massachusetts friendships were still very important to me. And Elliot Richardson reached across generational lines and party lines to befriend me and take me out to lunch and explain how Washington worked or how often it did not work. And I was always grateful for that friendship. So we began to talk about how to go back to those days. And we are so lucky tonight to have John Dean and Bill Weld with us. I have a feeling we're not only going to talk about Boston. We may not talk about Boston that much at all because we have larger problems as a country. We're coming up very soon to one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And we all know that we have to search deeply in our consciences, to use that word again, to find the right way forward. And that has often included people who want to go against the party they grew up loving. So I know we'll hear a lot on those topics tonight from both John Dean and Bill Weld. I'll introduce them briefly. John Dean was White House Counsel from 1970 to 1973. Prior to that, he was Chief Minority Counsel to the House Judiciary Committee from 1966 to 1967. He joined the Nixon administration in 1969 as an associate deputy in the Attorney General's office, became White House Counsel a year later, and then his courageous decision to cooperate with the ongoing investigation of the Watergate scandal led ultimately and certainly contributed importantly to the resignation of President Nixon in August of 1974. Since then, he's been a prolific author, speaker on all of these questions, conscience and political courage. And he's also a very talented historian in his own right. He wrote a biography of Warren Harding based on growing up in Harding's hometown of Marion, Ohio. I was proud to write a book on an even more obscure president, Martin Van Buren, in the same series. He will be joined tonight by someone deeply familiar to all people from Massachusetts, Governor Bill Weld. He was the 68th governor of the Commonwealth from 1991 to 1997. He too was deeply affected by Watergate as a young legal counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary, where he worked alongside an up-and-coming lawyer on the Democratic side, Hillary Rodham Clinton, then Hillary Rodham. He was appointed U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts by President Reagan, 1981, became head of the criminal division of the Justice Department in 1986, a post he held until 1988 when he resigned on principle over the ethical lapses of his boss, the Attorney General Edwin Meese. He's had a very public career as an author and is still active in politics. He ran as the vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party in 2016, and earlier this year, he ran as a Republican seeking the Republican nomination against President Donald Trump. So we couldn't have two more impressive voices on the program, and I'm so delighted to welcome both of them, John Dean and Bill Weld. So
thank you. I guess
I could begin with a very general question for both of you. How did the Republican Party get from Elliot Richardson to Donald Trump? John?
How did we get the Republicans from Elliot Richardson to Donald Trump in less than 2 days discussion? That's a tough one. That came out of left field, sort of. I hadn't expected it. Elliot Richardson was certainly one able official. I knew Elliot first as a as a U.S. attorney assistant and met him there. But I think the short answer is, believe it or not, and I didn't mean to hype my book, is authoritarianism. That's what has changed in the party. Eliot was certainly somebody who could think for himself, do for himself, and did. That's a long way away from where we are today and what's tolerable and acceptable in the ranks of the Republican Party. I'm one who has watched the party sort of, in my mind, disintegrate. And Eliot is somebody who must be spinning in his grave, seeing where we've gone. I'm sure that we'd have had a principled resignation long ago if he were Attorney General today. And it kind of makes me shudder to think of Eliot's Department of Justice, actually even Bill's Department of Justice, and where we are today with William Barr's Department of Justice. So it's been a road down and not a road up, to give the best answer I can give off the cuff for that very difficult question, Ted.
I'll give you another angle, Ted, if you want.
Love it. Thank you.
So, you know, it wasn't one hop. I first worked in politics being a summer intern for Jack Javits of New York, senator from New York. And it was in the late 60s before I went to law school, and lions still roamed the earth. And if someone was giving an important speech in the Senate, the galleries would be filled with people who wanted to hear the speech, because they wanted to see whether they would be persuaded. Now, of course, if there's an important speech, it's at 3 in the morning and there's no one in the chamber. But so those were wonderful days. Skip over the 70s and get to quite a lot later time. 1994, I think, was a seminal election in terms of the growth of hyper-partisanship between the two parties. And I think that's the only thing that really allowed a Donald Trump to grab the gold ring, is that because of hyper-partisanship, which was partly redistricting, that meant the only reason you were going to lose your seat in Congress is if you lost a primary to someone to your right, if you were an R, or your left if you were a D. The result of that in the years after 1994 was that people stopped thinking. All they needed to know is, am I an R or am I a D? And if so, I'm going to run to the extreme to not lose my seat. And the time this is most forcibly brought home to me in my life was when I ran as a libertarian in 2016. And essentially, Gary Johnson, the presidential nominee, and we had served together as governors, and we were quite tight together. We thought we had a big highway up the middle because we were fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And that didn't describe either of the other two parties. But it didn't matter, because the hyper-partisanship had set in, and there was gridlock and lockjaw there, and no one was thinking anymore. So what you needed as a predicate for Donald Trump, I think the one indispensable predicate would be a lack of thought in Washington. And he capitalized on that beautifully. And that's how we got from the era of the Kennedys in the Senate and Jack Javits, and it was a wonderful time, to Donald Trump. I think is a function of the really elephantiasis of the two-party system.
Wonderful word. I apologize to both of you. In my haste to get into a history discussion, which is my natural area of interest, I preempted your opening statement. So can we back up a little bit, and would you like to give them?
I didn't really have an opening statement, but I was thinking that for me, the title of Standing Up, Stepping Forward, and Speaking Out has occurred in a couple of ways. One is in a decision to testify, and the other is in writing books. Not going to take us too deep into the weeds of Watergate, but I was a very young, unseasoned attorney who was plucked out of the Department of Justice to come over to the White House to work. As you mentioned in the introduction, I was the Associate Deputy Attorney General and really doing the liaison at the Department of Justice with Congress, where I had started my career as the quickly rising to become the Chief Minority Counsel of the Judiciary Committee. So I knew my way around the Hill. And while working there, I was approached by one of John Ehrlichman's aides telling me that Ehrlichman was going to become an assistant to the president and asked, would John Mitchell let me come over to the White House to work? And I said, I have no idea. I think the person to answer that is John Mitchell. And they said, well, would you be interested in being White House counsel? Well, I knew right away that John Ehrlichman was giving up the title and not the job. He would indeed remain White House counsel, and I would take the job and get the title and get all the grunt work. In my 1,000-some days at the White House, I really only had 39 one-on-one sessions with Richard Nixon. The rest of them were in group meetings and what have you. But I did find myself standing up because I just couldn't believe what was going on in the White House where I found myself. The most eye-opening experience occurred about a year after I had arrived at the White House, when a person who'd been assigned to my staff by the name of Jack Caulfield, a former New York City detective, came into the office and said, John, you got to get me out of a problem I'm into. I said, well, what kind of problem are you in, Jack? He said, well, I just came from Chuck Colson's office. Chuck being a former aide to Saltonstall, Senator Saltonstall, and then having been a Washington lawyer, had come over as a special counsel to Nixon. And he was known as Nixon's hatchet man. Chuck was pretty good at stirring up trouble and having special interest get behind some of Nixon's projects. Anyway, I said, well, what's the problem? And Jack said, I have been asked, if not ordered by Colson, to firebomb the Brookings Institute. I said, what? He said, hang on, there's more to it. I not only firebomb the Brookings Institute, but once the fire department comes to organize a team, will break into the Brookings, get into the safe at the Brookings, and take some papers that the president thinks belong to the government out of the safe. I said, Jack, this is insanity. Don't do anything. And I flew to San Clemente to meet with my predecessor, John Ehrlichman, and tell him what was going on. I said, John, this is insane. I said, I pulled the DC code down, and it's a capital offense if anybody dies as a result of arson. This is just insanity. Ehrlichman picked up the phone, called Colson while I was sitting there, said, Colson, young counsel dean here, does not think the Brookings plan's a very good one. Cancel it. And he hung up the phone, looked over, anything else, counselor? I said, no, John, that'll do it, and flew back to Washington. But as I say, that was an eye-opening experience. As a result of that, and my intervening, I later learned from other aides, and historically I know now, as a result of my having the good sense, not political courage, to interrupt that operation, I was cut out of something that was called the Plumbers Unit when Nixon was trying to track down leaks. I know also today that there were about 3 conversations that were recorded where Nixon is pounding on his desk and ordering the break-in in the Brookings Institute. He thinks that they have papers that are related somehow to the so-called Pentagon Papers, the study of the origin and the war in Vietnam. It's often been suspected those papers also dealt with something that was known as the bombing halt study that was done as to whether or not Nixon had intervened as a candidate to block Lyndon Johnson's efforts to get a peace accord with between the North and South of Vietnam, but he had promised South Vietnam a better deal once he was president. Well, who knows what exactly the papers were that he was looking for. Anyway, the the canceled Brookings got John Dean canceled from any activities to do with the plumbers, which they knew I would have objected to. The plumbers would go on to perform other nefarious activities, like a break-in into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in September of 71, the Brookings being in roughly July of 71. So they would bring people on with that mentality and capacity. As I say, I learned about some of this after the fact, after Watergate. And I make these points because they tell us a couple things. First of all, Watergate is often believed to be a cover-up of a bungled burglary at the Democratic National Committee. That was just the tip of the iceberg that was uncovered by the arrest at the Democratic National Committee. And what was actually being covered up, I know today from having done a book where I transcribed endless hours of Nixon's conversations on Watergate, that each person sort of came to the cover-up with different motives. Nixon really didn't know about a lot of these activities. He knew some of them, and he was warned by Haldeman after the arrest at the Watergate of some of them, but not many. Ehrlichman was up to his eyeballs in all this and was, to me, the darkest hand, playing the cards closest to his chest all the way along. The others, I think, innocently got involved and mistakenly got involved in the cover-up. No one had heard of obstruction of justice until Watergate. That put it on the map. Anyway, I would break rank finally because it was just stupid what we were doing, and it was ongoing. And I realized that when Nixon finally calls on me after a few meetings with him. I don't know how much he knows. I don't know what to tell him. I, for example, tell him about the Ellsberg break-in. He said he had no idea. Why hadn't that been cleared with him? I said, I have no idea. And he's always said that's the first he ever learned of the Ellsberg break-in. I have no reason to doubt him. Ehrlichman said he had told him earlier, after the taping system became known. Ehrlichman claimed it happened on a beach in California, conveniently. But anyway, whether he knew or not it was apparent to me. He was certainly surprised that I knew. And it was to stand up and break rank became very easy. After I started dealing with Nixon, I realized I could involve him in things because I knew I was involved at that point. I'd let my fingers do the walking, pulled out the criminal code, knew we were breaking the law, very uncomfortable about it. I went to my superior again, John Ehrlichman, and had a fascinating argument with him. Some of it disappeared from the tapes. A little bit of it is still on the tapes, where he claimed he didn't have criminal intent in any of his activities because his motives were good. I think he misclassed the day at Stanford, where he was going to school with a future Chief Justice Bill Rehnquist and classmate Sandra Day O'Connor on what criminal intent is. He'd take that argument to two juries and lose twice and be convicted for crimes when he said he had a good motive and no criminal intent. It doesn't quite work that way. But anyway, coming forward in Watergate was very easy for me. I tried to convince Nixon in a conversation that fortunately was recorded, because no one would have believed I would have laid out in 50 minutes all the information I did to try to get him to put his fist down on the table and end the insanity. I was unable to convince him. To the contrary, at the end of the conversation, he's asking me to write a bogus report. So I realized my arguments have not carried the day, but I've also put him in a situation where he can really no longer deal with me. I said, people are going to go to jail. And he said, like who? I said, like me, to make sure that he knew I thought I was in serious trouble, and I just wasn't trying to point fingers at others. Anyway, to solve that problem, I've now listened to hours of conversations that followed my confronting Nixon with all these facts, where he and Haldeman and Ehrlichman discuss what to do about me and what to do about Watergate. And fortunately, I had a good inside contact that told me that they had come up with a plan, that they would make John Mitchell responsible for the bungled break-in at the Watergate and make me responsible for the cover-up. I put out a statement, never talked to the press when I was White House counsel. I put out a statement to the press. They were making a mistake if they made me the scapegoat. They talked to me after that, after several weeks of silence, and I told them that the answer was for me to hire a lawyer, which I was going to do, and I'd be happy to share what I was doing, and that's what I did. After hiring a lawyer, I actually went to him to telling him I wanted to do a plea deal. He said, well, John, I don't do pleas, but I'll advise you after we get all the facts and figures and figured out what your options are. We tried internally to continue to get Haldeman and Ehrlichman to do the right thing. I would force the issue with Nixon when I refused to resign unless Haldeman and Ehrlichman did also, because I told him, and this is all, of course, on tapes, that it wouldn't cure his problem if it was just me, that he needed to clean house totally. He ultimately would do that, but then he would bring in the head of the criminal division and totally corrupt the process through that. Fortunately, a special prosecutor, a special counsel was selected, and the rest would be history, of course. So coming forward was not a matter of great political courage. It was just a matter of conscience to internally try to break the stupidity of engaging in criminal conduct, and then to come forward and to put it in context. No one would really understand it if I had just kept myself to the very narrow issues relating to Watergate and the cover-up. It was a part of an atmosphere it happened in. It was one of many actions. And that really upset Nixon that I had laid that out. As he said in his memoir, he knew he'd never recover from my testimony because I had really explained what exactly was going on. And I thought that was the only way to end it. So that was a very early drill in doing what is right and being the best solution, and cover-ups always failing unless you have prompt disclosure. I have then done a number of books where I have taken on issues, particularly as I've watched the party I was once a devoted member of, the Republican Party, to me, disintegrate. And as I said earlier, when you asked me about from Richardson to Trump, what a road that is, the question's still stunning me, Ted.
Yes, sorry about
I can't get my head around it, in fact. It's such a distance. But anyway, I've seen a descent into authoritarianism. And I can back it up and say it as a matter of fact, because of polling done by the Monmouth University Polling Institute based on my last book. The Republican Party today is dominated by authoritarian personalities. It is documentable. When I'm talking about authoritarianism, I'm talking about not only the authoritarian type behavior of a leader, in this instance, Donald Trump, I'm also looking at those who put that person in power. And they, to me, are more important, the people who follow such a leader. Who are these people? Because I don't believe you can really understand republicanism unless you understand who these personalities are. That's the last book I did. I joined with a man who'd helped me very much on a book I did called Conservatives Without Conscience, a book I started with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, who was upset when the religious right had begun to take over the Republican Party and the conservative movement, and it distressed him deeply because he said, these people, you can't negotiate with them. They are going to destroy the Republican Party if they take it over. And he was right. He and I didn't finish the book because he got ill, but I picked it up and finished it. And the man who was very helpful with me, Bob Altemeyer, is the person with whom I collaborated to really understand Trump's authoritarianism. And by that, I mean, who are these people who tolerate his norm-busting anti-democratic behavior? To me, you can't understand the election this year. The book I've written is not about the latest sensations that are coming out on Trump's behavior, but they're explanations of why his base is going to stay with him. The revelations today about his conversations with Bob Woodward. I don't think he will lose a percentage of his base. They're going to stay there. Psychologically, they are wed to him. And that's what this latest book explains. So with those opening thoughts and remarks, I will turn it back to you, Ted.
Thank you. Governor, there was a lot to unpack in there. Do you want to respond to what John just said, or do you want to go back to your opening statement?
I think I'm going to tell my story. I was sitting at my desk at my law firm as a third-year associate in late 1973 when the phone rings from a fellow Ripon Republican in Boston, Marty Linsky. He says, I got a call from Tom Railsback in Illinois. He said they're looking for sane Republicans to come work on the Judiciary Committee on the impeachment inquiry. Would you be interested? And I said, no, I got to stay here and make partner. And then I called him back 1 minute later and said, change my mind. So I went down and it was December of '73. And I was the first person hired for the staff. And the other person who'd been hired for the staff was Hillary Rodham. So we report for duty in John Doerr's office, and he says, Bill, Hillary, I need a definition of what's impeachable conduct by a president. Why don't you, I don't want to ruin your weekend, have it on my desk Tuesday. Well, it took 40 lawyers, 6 months to figure out that Jerry Ford was right when he said an impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House and 2/3 of the Senate says it is. But that was one big criminal conspiracy case, and it caused me to transfer from corporate law to litigation. When I went back to my law firm, I developed a taste for the criminal side of things and the capacity through investigative work to uncover things that everyone had a motive to conceal. I had to listen to all the Watergate tapes. My favorite moment was when someone, I think it might have been the hero of Watergate, John Dean, then 34 years old. John, you can tell me whether it was you or not, but whoever it was talking to Nixon and saying, well, these Watergate conspirators, they may not hold up all that well. They have human problems. And Nixon says, union problems? And his interlocutor says, no, human problems. And Nixon says, oh, human problems. And his tone of voice says, let me make a note of that, or somebody remind me. But a lot of
that was September 15 of
so it was you.
72, yes.
It was you. But a lot of the rest of the tapes were not all that great. So I went back to my office, and a few years later, and I may say, and Ted, I think you adverted to this at the beginning, Massachusetts had a rich history of uncovering wrongdoing. The Mass Crime Commission in '62-63 made the reputation of Edward Brooke, later became my mentor in politics. Two of my partners at my law firm were active there. The McKee-Berger-Mansueto scandal and the Ward Commission, which was the late '70s, presided over by Bill Ward, John William Ward, found all kinds of corruption. And I got it in my head that corruption is not a victimless offense because the public is the victim and good government is a victim. But everyone has an incentive to conceal it. So I became obsessed with how do you uncover it? And I ran for Attorney General of the state in 1978, knowing nothing and nobody. And my platform was we have to use statewide investigative grand juries to uncover corruption, such as was shown by the Crime Commission in the '60s and the MBM scandal in the '70s. And I got absolutely nowhere, but that thought never really left me. So that was the beginning of a lifelong embrace of the idea that corruption and like narcotics is not a large-scale narcotics, is not a victimless crime. And not so long after Bill Ward's commission, Ronald Reagan appointed me U.S. attorney, and I made public corruption my #1 priority, the only U.S. attorney in the country to do that. Everyone else said narcotics. And then I went down to Washington to be assistant AG in charge of the criminal division. Ditto, did the same thing. And I did resign from the department together with Arnie Burns, the deputy AG, because we felt that Ed Meese, who's basically a good man, basically a very good man, but he'd not taken off his White House hat when he came over to the Justice Department. And that's fatal to the Justice Department, upon whose walls are emblazoned the motto of the department, to do justice without fear or favor. And that was observed somewhat in the breach, I'm so sorry to say, to the extent that I felt obliged to resign, as did Arnie and our top 4 aides, to each. So that kind of launched me on the path to the governorship, where I again was out of step with my party because of my, being a social liberal, although a fiscal conservative. And yet, when you're a governor, you're not subject to the same pressures that members of Congress and the Senate are, because you've gotten elected all by yourself. So nobody gave me any problem about that. But the issue never really left me, and I consider it quite a Massachusetts vertical that has steered and guided my life.
I've been a Democrat my whole life, and I always voted for you when I lived in Massachusetts. And in Rhode Island, I always voted for John Chafee and then Link Chafee. And it was a great privilege to be from New England with these progressive Republicans. And I think it made our system much better. I wonder if I could just ask a very specific history question. Catherine alluded to the MHS and its connection to Watergate. And, the son of the editor of the Adams Papers, the editor was Lyman Butterfield in the 50s and 60s, and his son Fox Butterfield became a New York Times journalist who co-authored the Pentagon Papers. And I wonder why Nixon was so worried about a history. I mean, it's an interesting thing in the first place because it is a historical document about the Vietnam War, but it largely describes the misdeeds of the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administration. So why was Nixon so worried about the Pentagon Papers?
The best reconstruction of those events and listening to the tapes of that period indicate that it occurred the weekend that Tricia Nixon was married. There was a White House wedding on that Saturday. And on Sunday, Nixon went into the Oval Office to look at the coverage of the wedding and saw this headline relating to what later was called the Pentagon Papers being released as the banner headline in the Sunday Times. He read it, and his first reaction was, "This is terrific. This doesn't hurt us at all. It certainly is going to be a black mark for the Democrats." So his initial reaction is to think this is just fine. What happened on Monday is Kissinger gets a hold of him and tells him that this will affect his ability to deal with North Vietnam in the Paris peace talks, and could affect their relationship, then secret relationship with China, where they're trying to develop the trip to China. And this is what frightens Nixon. Kissinger, who is very aware of Ellsberg, and by then they had figured out that this was Ellsberg who had leaked the papers. Kissinger has a relationship with Ellsberg that is not good. And he tells Nixon that if they don't go after Ellsberg and they can't protect their secrets, that he can't deal with other governments. This is what starts the effort. And on Monday, I get a call from Ehrlichman, who's in the Oval Office, wanting to know if a newspaper can be prosecuted and criminally by the Department of Justice. I said, well, I better ask the Department of Justice that. I tried to get a hold of Bill Rehnquist at the Office of Legal Counsel. He was out with a back problem, talked to his deputy, a fellow named Kuiper, and they talked to the criminal division and got back to me and said, it's possible, it's not our policy to prosecute newspapers. And then they proceeded to go for the injunction, which of course they got in New York with a judge who's his first day on the bench. The first time there's ever been prior restraint in anything of that dimension. So that's the genesis of Nixon's reaction to it, where he then takes it on as a cause. And I think he thinks the politics of it are playing in his favor.
Governor, do you want to add to that, or?
No, just a footnote. I actually did a lot of business with Fox Butterfield when I was U.S. Attorney. As I said, my top priority was public corruption, and we had convictions in 110 out of our 111 public corruption cases. And Fox had been relatively recently assigned to the Boston Bureau of the Times. And he covered this thing like a glove. It was like he'd discovered an aboriginal tribe of totally corrupt individuals who happened to populate state and city government in Boston. He wanted the whole world to know it. So these tiny obscure little cases about people who went out on disability pension fraud, pretending to have a bad back when they didn't, but they would get $1 million pension as a result. It's exactly the sort of reason I was prosecuting those cases. He did put that Aboriginal tribe on full view for the entire world to see. I remember Kevin White, who was then the mayor, saying, what is this? What are these cases about? Yuri Andropov in Moscow is opening up the Sunday New York Times and seeing this on page 1? What's going on here? Anyway, that was a Butterfield connection.
You mentioned Marty Linsky a few minutes ago, and I have it on good authority that he's watching this because he's watching with my dad in Rhode Island. So,
well, he gave me my start, and I repaid the favor years later when I made him my chief political guy in the governor's office in the State House, and we had a wonderful time together. My real political start was when I did some volunteer research for Marty in the State House when I was in law school, which he remembered, which is why he called me when Tom Railsback called him.
There's another way it feels like Boston was connected to Watergate. It's not exactly high principles, but there were so many former Kennedy people involved. So the break-in in the Watergate is into the office of Larry O'Brien. And throughout my memory of reading about the plumbers is there was a period where Hunt was going around New England with a fake wig on, trying to get dirt on Teddy Kennedy. Nixon was always very worried about Teddy Kennedy. And was the shadow of all of the Kennedy brothers part of the beginning of the Watergate, or was it just the paranoia that Ted Kennedy might run? Was that driving some of this?
I think
total paranoia.
I think the early, when I got to the White House, and one of the questions I kept asking myself is, who can I call to ask, is this standard procedure at a White House? And there was just nobody. I didn't know who to call because I was watching things like the enemies list, and Jack Caulfield, who I mentioned earlier, came in and was regaling me with how when Teddy Kennedy had his accident at Chappaquiddick, he had dispatched a former New York City detective by the name of Anthony Ulasewicz to go up to Chappaquiddick and pretend to be a newsman. They had gotten him full news credentials. And Ulasewicz was a very sharp investigator, and he was asking all of the embarrassing questions at the press conferences to raise the issues to make sure they got coverage. So it sort of surprised me about how paranoid Nixon was about Kennedy. Chuck Colson, who I also mentioned, had an operation where he was tracking Teddy Kennedy constantly. They purchased pictures of him in Hawaii, and they had somebody else when he was traveling with a companion who was on it. There was a constant feeding of political intelligence that I wasn't directly privy to, but did pick up from time to time. And it scratched my head as to, why. I mean, it just seemed opposition research is obviously a part of political campaigns, but it just seemed out of place in a White House. But by today's standards, certainly not.
Let me back up a little bit. And this may be, Ted, going back to your question about how do we get from the era of Elliot Richardson to the era of Donald Trump. In 1946, Nixon and Jack Kennedy both come out of the military. They come back to Washington. They're both congressmen. By most people's estimation, at that point, Nixon would have been thought one of the more intelligent, centrist, future face of the Republican Party by most people. And I venture to say that if he hadn't had the two red-baiting campaigns against Jerry Voorhees and Helen Gahagan Douglas out in California, the left would not have developed a lifelong obsession for hating Richard Nixon. And, the Watergate thing is inexcusable. He blundered into it, and then he held on, and he paid with his office. But Nixon did have a sense of shame, and he had a sense of history. And you saw that with the opening to China, but you saw that in the, frankly, quite brilliant books that he wrote after he was drummed out of office. And Nixon, my opinion is that Nixon on his worst day is infinitely preferable to Donald J. Trump on his best day. And Nixon did have the enemies list. That's one of the worst things about him. You think Donald Trump doesn't have an enemies list 10 miles long in his head? I mean, Steve Bannon, who's his political mentor during his campaign, said, let me tell you what's going to happen if Donald Trump is reelected. You're going to see 4 years of unrequited payback. Does anyone doubt that? It's almost unthinkable. When I ran as a libertarian, my first TV appearance, I was asked, let me give you a name and you tell me the first word that comes to your mind. Donald Trump, huckster. And then I said that some of the things he was saying reminded me of Kristallnacht, and I was off to the races. But Adolf Hitler at least had good campaign lines. We have to open the Prussian military to the sons and daughters of the working class. But I think it's become increasingly obvious that the current president, is somewhat untethered from reality, and he doesn't make any bones about the fact that he wants to usher in an autocracy. He talks about not respecting the results of the election. He says a free press is the enemy of the people. He says an independent judiciary is the enemy of the people. Talk about doing justice without fear or favor being inscribed on the walls of the Justice Department. This guy's way out there in the class by himself.
We're starting to get a lot of great questions, and I want to remind the audience you can use your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best, although I don't think we can get to all of them, but a very good one just came in from someone named Christopher. So we have a kind of echo today. There's a new book by Woodward out called Rage, with a lot of very serious allegations against Donald Trump. And the question is, will that move the needle at all with his base? Whereas All the President's Men, when it came out, was read by millions of people around the country and had a very serious effect. But is Trump just impervious to this kind of a book and these kinds of criticisms in 2020?
It's not the question of Trump, who probably is accustomed to these, it's his base. And that's been the focus of my study for a couple of years now. As I said, they are authoritarian followers. There are two types of personalities. They're people called social dominators who are willing to follow a higher person on the pecking order than themselves, but they're pretty nasty people. There are also a milder type that really are the bulk of the followers. And as I say, we tested these people with personality tests through the Monmouth University Polling Institute, and found they are bona fide authoritarian personalities. They are willing to submit to the authority of Donald Trump. They are aggressive on behalf of that authority, and they are very conventional in their lives otherwise, but they are highly religious. Many of them are not well educated, and he is the final word. Will these revelations affect this base? Well, I was writing an op-ed, drafting one on the comment about the military, how he thinks that suckers and losers are in the military, and whether that would affect his base. It will not. Will the next step? I doubt it. As I said in my opening remarks, I don't think 1% will be affected by these revelations. And I'm sure Woodward has not led with his strongest stuff in the book. These are all teases for the book. Mm-hmm. That's the reason I did my book. And you can't do this in sound bites, explain almost a half century of scientific research on these types of personalities. But they are built in, and the strongest kind of base any politician has ever had. And the glue of their relationship is prejudice. They just went off the chart in our Monmouth poll as far as their prejudice went. So they're not going anywhere.
Ted, let me say one thing. Even if it doesn't move his base, that's not going to be enough for him to win the election. Just his base by itself is not going to win Mr. Trump the election. Having said that, I'd go even further. I think that there's no question that there are a bunch of zealots and white supremacists within the Trump base. During the 2016 election, it was well known that his campaign would put out instant videograms of George Lincoln Rockwell, and then they would disappear from the screen. And everyone except the white supremacists would say, "What was that? I missed that." But they knew damn well who George Lincoln Rockwell was. He was the founder of the American Nazi Party. And I've often said the Trump campaign of 2016 was an unbroken series of dog whistles. So there's no question, John is right. There are people like that who are elements of the Trump base. Myself, I think at least a third of the Trump base is wealthy people who consider themselves economic conservatives, and they have been willing to sit still for a lot of other stuff. And I've made it my mission to kind of try and sound the call for the abrading of the rule of law and constitutional principles, and the fact that, Mr. Trump might as well be holding a ceremony in the South Lawn every day, burning the U.S. Constitution for all the fidelity to it that he has shown. And I think a lot of those people are going to peel off. So I think at the end of the day, he's going to be well short of a majority.
Oh, well, that leads to a very good question we have from a Dr. Doherty. Is the Republican Party salvageable from its descent into lawlessness, or is a new principled conservative party possible and necessary?
Well, let me jump on that one, John, if
yes,
I may.
please.
I think, first of all, if Mr. Trump wins the election, there really won't be a Republican Party. There will just be a support group for this man who's succeeded in arrogating total power to himself without having shown any fidelity to any principle whatsoever. So you can forget the Republican Party at that point. If Trump loses, I think an effort should be undertaken to reconstitute the Republican Party by, expelling the white supremacists, or just saying, we're going to try to make this without you. Moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats. I think a lot of practical libertarians could join that. A lot of environmentalists could join that. And you might cobble together another party, which would start out perhaps not even being called the Republican Party. It might be called the Unity Party or something like that. And it would perhaps start out as a third party, but if you look at the history in Britain with Labour outstripping the Liberals, and that has not come unstuck yet, Labour came up pretty quick, they could become the second party. And I'm one of those who harks back to the Whig Party, the dissolution of the Whigs in the 1850s, and they blew up, and the Northern Wing joined John C. Fremont and the Free Soilers, and 4 years later, they elected Abraham Lincoln president of the United States. This is the anti-slavery wing. And the other wing, the Southern pro-slavery, they were the very carbon copy of the Trump wing of the current Republican Party. They were born in anti-immigrant prejudice. They hated Catholics at that point, not Muslims. They hated all the new immigrants from Ireland and Germany. And they held secret rallies and secret meetings. And they were called the Know Nothing Party because they were instructed to say, if anyone asked them about their secret meetings, I know nothing. Well, they disappeared. And my hope is that that faction of Donald Trump's coalition will equally disappear back into the shadows from whence they came.
John, do you want to venture a prediction about the future of the Republican Party?
I would certainly second, I think, everything that Bill has said. I think if this is a tsunami election, which hopefully it will be, because that's the way to put these people who have such undemocratic thinking as their way of thinking or lack of thinking back in the shadows where it's unacceptable and intolerable behavior. So there is that potential. We don't know how this is going to play out. Some of the interesting polling we did in the Monmouth survey indicated that there's about 25% of Trump's base who will tolerate him resisting leaving. While the laws are incomplete, there are scenarios where indeed he could be a nightmare if he loses the election. And he has enough in his base who would support that and could cause violence in the streets. And that's the result we must hope against. I think if it's a tsunami election, that won't happen. And that's the best way to persuade these authoritarian personalities that they're on the wrong boat and to get off of it and go do something else.
You both worked in the Justice Department, and Governor, you spoke beautifully about the words on the exterior. Are there structural changes? So not just a new president and new people in the cabinet, but are there structural changes to the government that you would advocate to help us out of this darkness and build in some peace of mind for our children and their children?
John, you first.
As there occurred during post-Watergate, there was a decade of reform. I think post-Trump, if he is defeated, there's going to be a decade or more of reform. All those norms that he's so easily broken, many of them are going to be codified, like the relationship that was informally set between the Department of Justice and the White House, where the White House didn't deal with the department, excepting in very narrow and controlled circumstances. I think that the Attorney General Barr has created a situation where a lot of these reforms are going to be focused right on the Department of Justice. But yes, it is. We're going to have and if Trump is reelected, it's all Katie bar the door. We're not going to recognize the country in 4 years.
I think John is right. I mean, the president commits outright violations of law every day. And it's kind of hard to say, well, we're going to pass a new law saying we really mean it. On the other hand, he also violates every norm and every sort of soft rule that has governed the growth of our executive departments and the relationship between the legislature and the executive in Washington over history. And I think John is right. A lot of things are going to have to be codified that always went without saying before. But there's going to be a lot of ring fences drawn around the office of the Attorney General. The memo that Bill Barr, who used to be a stand-up guy when he was AG before, the memo that he sent in June of 2018 to Trump, technically to Rod Rosenstein, but clearly auditioning for the job of Attorney General, saying basically the president can do anything he wants, because if it's an enumerated power of the president, like the pardon power, for example, you can't go behind the president's jural act of exercising his power. So it wouldn't matter if he was pardoning 6 of his cronies because they paid him $1 million bribes. You could not go behind that act, or it'd be a slippery slope, and next thing you know, we'd be a banana republic. That was the thesis of Bill Barr's memo in June of 2018. And man, that one's going to have to be dealt with frontally, and that'll be a statute, I think.
We have a question from Elizabeth Morse. Can you comment on the Lincoln Project?
Those are my friends. Stuart Stevens did all my campaigns. I think they're great. Stevens, Schmidt, Weaver, and they're out there saying that, well, they want to have all Republicans defeated. I'm not so sure about that. I'd like a little raw material to work with in the form of moderate Republicans as we go about the reconstituting process. But aside from that, I think they're doing the Lord's work.
Amen.
Brett Wilson asks, is there any hope for a John Dean of the Trump administration?
Well, that came up a lot during the pre-impeachment period, during a number of the scandals, if anybody would come forward. It's been surprising that none of the lawyers have really done what they might have done. One of the things I have done post-Watergate, when I was working on my last book where I transcribed all the Nixon tapes, I realized there's some really invaluable lessons in there for lawyers, both positive and negative stuff. And so I created something called the Watergate CLE, and I've done with a partner, about 250 of those programs by now, and just word of mouth. And as a result, I'm familiar with the ethics laws of virtually maybe 35, 40 states, and watched how, particularly in representation of an organization, the ABA's model code really clarified the role of the attorney vis-a-vis the organization, where the attorney represents the organization, not the constituents of the organization. Translate to the White House Counsel doesn't represent Donald Trump, they represent the office of the president. Well, that's been forgotten. And one of the stunning things that happened on the floor of the Senate during the impeachment trial were lawyers getting up and making false statements, just one after another after another. I happened to call DC Bar Counsel, or a former one, and we were talking about it, and he said, John, this is so far beyond ethics problems. We're dealing with criminal law problems, and the Department of Justice is obviously not going to do anything about them. So,
no, go ahead.
So I think there's going to be a blowback by the bar as well on a lot of this.
I think in a way, Ted, in answer to your question, if there were a John Dean in the Trump administration, the ultimate whistleblower, as it were, I'm not sure it would make that much difference. Trump would say this guy is a loser and he's a sucker and he's got tremendous personal problems. And by the way, he just got fired, and they would, drum up a bunch of false allegations against him. And then Trump would steam right on and say, but it's all fine because I did this and I did that and I did the other. And, how many times have we thought the guy was politically dead and buried because of something he has said? He is his own whistleblower. As people have pointed out, he says the quiet part out loud. I think Trump's Achilles heel electorally is that he has no interest in increasing his base. He's not looking to broaden his base one little bit. He loves his base loves him, and he doesn't think in any other terms. So I'm now devoting a lot of my energy to vote by mail campaigns and maximizing the vote by whatever means. And I don't care if I'm maximizing Democrat votes or Republican votes. I just want more people voting. And Trump will say, and has said many times out loud, I hate vote by mail. The more people that vote, the more likely I'm going to lose. So he's kind of it's a cross between an idiot savant and someone with Tourette's syndrome. He blurts out the truth about himself quite a bit. I don't think we need a John Dean in there. I think he does a pretty good job of carrying the message himself.
Well, just to footnote Bill's point, Woodward wisely recorded him, apparently some 18 recordings, and he's released those, or is releasing them with the book. And that's wise, because Trump would have obviously said, he's distorted what I've said, he's lying, this is all fake news. But now Woodward is coming out with Trump's own words. So it is Trump on Trump at this point, and that's going to be as powerful as it gets.
Do you think if Trump had tacked to the center earlier and better, which was certainly possible looking at his campaign, his anti-Iraq war rhetoric was, pretty similar to the way a lot of people on the left think. Do you think he would be in a better political position now for re-election if he'd actually done a little governing with the opposition?
Oh, absolutely. But that would require him being a totally different person. He's obsessed with his drive for autocracy. I can remember watching the early Republican primary debates when there were 12 of them on stage, standing up after 3 answers in a row saying, wait a minute, he just gave the best answer. Trump was in some ways the most appealing candidate up there. It's before the real dark Trump emerged. I think he could have, if he just not been so unhinged. There's personality issues there, obviously. And if that weren't the case, and if he had just said, well, I brought the troops home, that could be a powerful argument. I can tell you it would go down well in the libertarian community.
We have a really good question from Ann Landsberg. Hard question. Why, with the exception of Mitt Romney, have Republicans in the Senate remained absolutely silent regarding the outrages of Trump's presidency, especially regarding constitutional matters?
I can't answer that, and I think it's the biggest outrage of the entire Trump presidency that everybody except Mitt Romney decided to, like Neshoba County in the civil rights cases, fold their arms and close their eyes.
I think they're afraid of him. His base is very powerful, and it's solidly glued to him, and they know that. They're shrewd enough politicians to understand that he can mobilize that base against anybody, and these people don't want to be primaried, or they don't want to have difficulties, and that base will likely stay with Trump even if he loses. While they'll be looking for the next leader, at least in the interim, they will be there. So I think they'll remain frightened of that base and what Trump can do with it.
Carlos is asking, with massive concerns over COVID in voting, how should we think about the mechanics of getting a validated election result and judicial challenges to mail-in voting issues and other technical concerns on November 3rd?
I live in a almost totally blue state, so I'm not the best person to answer that. We've been doing mail-in in California ever since I've lived here for almost 50 years now. So I'll let Bill handle that.
Well, judicial challenges in court to mail-in voting, I think the judiciary can probably handle that one. There's enough info out there. You look at Colorado, Utah that have been doing this for a generation with no problem. So it's not going to be an ipso facto, voting by mail is unconstitutional and doesn't work. The plaintiffs are going to have to prove their case there, and they're not going to be able to. At the end of the day, if the president says, well, I'm declaring because of vote by mail, this whole election is invalid, I think the judicial department of our government is not going to sit still for that. And if he says, oh, you're all fired or something like that, I hate to say it, but it may be that you'll have to have law enforcement, meaning police, not necessarily the Attorney General of the United States, backed up ultimately by the military, which I think is going to part company with the president if he says, I'm staying. The first thing that will happen is the Secret Service will politely escort him from the White House, where he will then be a trespasser. And if he says, well, I want my people to go take out their guns and go after the Secret Service, U.S. military is not going to let that happen.
Well, as of January 20th, if it's not all resolved, Nancy Pelosi will be president too.
I'm getting a message that we have time for 2 more questions. One is, do you think Donald Trump might be prosecuted after leaving office?
Absolutely no question about it. U.S. Constitution says that after a president leaves office, quote, he shall be liable to indictment, prosecution, and punishment, period. That's a direct quote. As I say, he's not only violated norms, he's violated more laws than you can shake a stick at. And, you know, he richly deserved to be impeached and removed from office for what he did with Ukraine. The two things the framers of our Constitution were most worried about is foreign interference and corruption of the president himself so that he would act in his own personal advantage, political, financial, whatever. And Trump has gone so far beyond anything that was ever envisioned or conceived of by the framers that we've kind of lost our taste buds. People don't realize what a clear and overwhelming case for impeachment that was. And I think one of the heroes is going to be Adam Schiff. Not something you want to hear, Mr. President, but he put on a very powerful case.
Obviously, it's a political question. And by tradition, presidents don't recommend prosecution of their predecessors. That certainly happened when Obama came in and there was pressure to go after Cheney and Bush for war crimes in the waterboarding issue, and that was not even examined. I don't think that Biden has spoken to the question at this point. I suspect before November 3rd, he will get the question. I don't know how he'll answer it. I certainly think they ought to prosecute. And I know that Cy Vance doesn't seem to be holding back in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. So it's going to happen at a state level, if not the federal level.
Okay, here's a final question from Jonathan Streff. What would you say to young people who only know Trump and his norm-bashing behavior, but are looking to get involved in politics?
Well, I would certainly encourage them to get involved. The young people I know, and I have 3 college-age granddaughters, and they are in varying degrees of political sophistication, and all of them anti-Trump, as their friends seem to be. One of the things we did in this book I've just finished and is now out is, after analyzing the voting patterns, realized that if the young people vote in this November, they can really make it a tsunami election. And so I'm working with a number of programs to try to encourage young people to vote and get involved. The lack of civics and the polling that's showing with the ignorance of people about the way just the fundamentals of government work is frightening. How many people, and some national surveys of how little people understand about the way the process works. It's frightening. So we have to get more young people involved.
So Ted, I've written a draft of a memoir. I'm not sure I'm going to put it out beyond family reading, but the title is Come On In, the Water's Fine. And I've lived a life in law and politics. It's been very rewarding, very nourishing, and I would encourage anyone who has an interest in law and politics and government and how we govern ourselves and how our society is organized to absolutely get involved with the public issues. You know, the more the merrier. Just as we want more people voting, we want more people involved in public life. And the more people that are involved, the less you'll have shadows there, so that people can commit some of the actions that are going on down now in the Trump White House in Washington, D.C.
These are both such wonderful answers. Thank you. I have a historian's thought I'll say quickly, and then I might turn it over to you to see if you want to wrap up your part of the night. But it's been such an honor to speak with John Dean and Governor Bill Weld. And my historian point, I was reading a speech by Ronald Reagan yesterday in a different context. It was a speech he gave at the Statue of Liberty on July 4th, 1986, not the famous speech, but a speech the next day. And he talked about how much people have sometimes hated each other in this country from different parties. And he specifically talked about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and the beginning of hyperpartisanship in our politics, and then went on to tell the story of how they became friends again. And their correspondence is a great monument to civility and to reaching across the aisle. And that correspondence, of course, is held in the MHS. So history doesn't solve all of our problems, but it gives us a few good ideas for how to get through things. So would either of you like to end with a concluding thought?
They both passed on the same day, too.
That's right.
July 4th, 1826, 50th anniversary of the Declaration. No, I would just say that when it started, it was not pretty. In the days of Philippe Freneau and the pamphleteers versus the Federalists, but Adams and Jefferson did forge a 50-year friendship. That's what to aim at. That and the like when I started in the Senate and lions roamed the earth. It is not only possible, it's likely if good people still will rally to that banner.
Well, thank you so much. Such an honor to talk with both of you. And I think Catherine Allgore would like to close out the evening.
Yes, and I just want to close out with a thank you to our panelists, to our moderator. And I want to give a special thank you to Gavin Cleespies, our Director of Public Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Engagement, and his colleague, Sarah Bertulli, for putting this all together. Thank you, everybody. We have more public programs. It's just the beginning of a great season, so we'll see you soon. Thank you.